Sometimes the mountains call to us when we need them most, and sometimes they hold secrets we never expected to find. Diana Walsh had been walking these Colorado trails for 30 years, finding peace in the wilderness after losing her husband, with only her golden retriever Scout for company. But on this crisp October morning, Scout stopped dead beside an old fallen tree. He wouldn't move, no matter how much Diana coaxed him. That's when she saw it. A strange round bump in the rotting wood, like the tree had grown around something important. Her hands shook as she stared at it. After all these years in the forest, she'd never seen anything like this. Something told her this wasn't just wood and bark. Something told her whatever was inside had been waiting for her to find it. What could be so important that it had been hidden in a tree for decades? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Diana Walsh stood at the edge of her cabin's wraparound porch, breathing in the thin mountain air that had become her lifeline over the past 3 years. At 63, she moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades reading the wilderness like others read books. The Colorado Rockies stretched endlessly before her, their peaks catching the first light of dawn in shades of gold and amber that never failed to steady her restless heart. Scout padded up beside her, his golden coat still thick from the changing season. He'd been Tom's dog first, a gift Diana had given her husband for his 50th birthday, back when their biggest worry was whether the geological surveys would keep Tom away from home too long. Now Scout was hers alone, the only living connection to a marriage that had filled 25 years with laughter, shared discoveries, and quiet evenings spent poring over topographical maps by lamplight. "Ready for our walk, boy?" she asked, scratching behind his ears. Scout's tail wagged, but his dark eyes held the same gentle sadness she saw in her own reflection. Dogs understood loss differently than humans, but they understood it all the same. The cabin sat at nearly 8,000 feet, perched on a natural shelf of granite that Tom had chosen specifically for its commanding view of the valley below. He'd built much of it himself during their early years together, back when Diana was still working as a forest ranger and Tom was establishing his geological survey business. Every beam and board held memories, Tom cursing good-naturedly as he struggled with the wiring, Diana bringing him coffee and sandwiches during long construction weekends, the two of them celebrating when they finally got the wood stove working properly. Inside, Tom's presence lingered in every corner. His geological survey maps still covered one wall of the study, and annotated with his careful observations about mineral deposits, water table changes, and geological formations that had fascinated him for decades. Diana had left everything exactly as it was the day he died, partly from sentiment and partly because his work still amazed her. Tom had possessed an almost supernatural ability to read the land, to understand how water moved through rock and how time shaped the bones of the earth. Diana pulled on her hiking boots, sturdy leather ones. Tom had bought her for their 20th anniversary and gathered her day pack. She'd learned long ago to be prepared for anything in the mountains. Water, emergency shelter, first aid supplies, rope, her father's old compass, and a small camping shovel that had proven useful more times than she could count. Tom had taught her that the wilderness demanded respect, and respect meant preparation. The trail she chose that morning was one of their favorites, a winding path that climbed gradually through stands of aspen and pine before opening onto a series of meadows that offered breathtaking views of the Continental Divide. She and Tom had walked this route hundreds of times, in every season and weather condition. He'd proposed to her at the highest point, down on one knee, in a patch of wildflowers with the entire world spread out below them. Diana had taken to walking alone since Tom's death, finding solace in the rhythm of her footsteps and the familiar weight of Scout at her side. The local folks in Cedar Ridge, the small valley town where she picked up supplies and mail, had grown accustomed to seeing her truck parked at various trailheads. They respected her solitude while still checking in when she came to town, understanding that grief was a journey best traveled at one's own pace. Morning. Diana, Betty Chen would call from behind the counter at the general store. How's Scout doing? Any interesting finds on your walks? Betty ran the store with her husband James, both of them transplants from California who'd fallen in love with mountain life 20 years ago. They'd become some of Diana's closest friends in Cedar Ridge, partly because they understood that small talk should stay small, and partly because they genuinely cared about the well-being of their neighbors. Doc Martinez, the veterinarian who ran a small practice out of a converted barn on the edge of town, always made time to check on Scout when Diana brought him in for his regular appointments. He's getting older, Doc would say gently, but he's still got good years ahead of him. Dogs his age sometimes get a bit more anxious, especially after losing someone they loved. Keep him close, keep him active, and he'll be fine. Sheriff Reynolds, a weathered man in his late 50s who'd grown up in these mountains, occasionally stopped by Diana's cabin just to check in. He'd known Tom well. They'd served together on the county emergency response team, and he understood that Diana's solitary lifestyle wasn't cause for concern, but rather a natural response to loss. You're the most prepared hermit in the state, Reynolds had joked during his last visit. Tom taught you well. If anyone can take care of herself up here, it's you. Diana appreciated these connections to the outside world, even as she treasured her solitude. The people of Cedar Ridge had embraced her and Tom when they first moved to the mountains, understanding that some folks were called to live closer to the sky. The town itself was small, maybe 800 year-round residents, but it had everything necessary for a simple life: the general store, Doc Martinez's practice, a volunteer fire department, and a small cafe that served as the unofficial community center. The morning of her discovery dawned clear and cold, with that crystalline quality of light that only came with high altitude and thin air. Diana had been walking for nearly an hour when she noticed Scout's behavior changing. The dog had always been attentive on their hikes, alert to the sights and sounds of the wilderness. But that morning, he seemed unusually focused on something she couldn't see. They were following a familiar trail through a grove of ancient pines when Scout suddenly stopped. Not the gradual pause of a dog catching an interesting scent, but an abrupt halt that spoke of something significant. Diana called to him softly, but he remained motionless, his attention fixed on a massive fallen pine that lay just off the trail. The tree was enormous, easily 6 feet in diameter and stretching nearly 100 feet from its severed trunk to its withered crown. Diana estimated it had been down for at least a decade, based on the amount of moss and decay she could see. Fallen giants like this were common in the high country, brought down by lightning, wind, or simply the weight of centuries. They became part of the forest floor, slowly returning their nutrients to the soil while providing shelter for countless smaller creatures. But Scout wasn't interested in the tree's normal function as a wilderness habitat. He'd approached a specific section of the trunk, about 30 feet from the base, and was whimpering softly while pawing at the rotting bark. Diana had never seen him behave this way before. She knelt beside him, running her hands along the section of trunk that had captured his attention. The wood was soft with decay, covered in a thick carpet of moss and small ferns. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just the normal process of a dead tree returning to the earth. But as she looked more carefully, following the line of Scout's focused gaze, she began to notice something that didn't belong there. Embedded in what remained of the pine's trunk was a distinct bulge in the wood grain. It was roughly oval-shaped, about the size of a football, and completely encased in the tree's natural growth. The wood had grown around whatever was inside, creating a seamless barrier that spoke of decades, perhaps longer, of patient concealment. Diana's forest ranger training kicked in as she examined the anomaly more closely. Trees could grow around foreign objects. She'd seen pines that had incorporated fence posts, old mining equipment, even bicycles left too long in one place. But this was different. The object appeared to have been deliberately placed within the tree's heartwood, and the growth pattern suggested it had been there for a very long time. She pulled out Tom's geological notebook, which she always carried on their walks together and had continued to bring even after his death. Tom had been meticulous about documenting unusual findings, and Diana had adopted his habit of recording anything that seemed out of place in the natural world. She sketched the location of the bulge within the fallen tree, noted the approximate size and shape, and recorded the GPS coordinates from the device Tom had taught her to use. As she worked, Scout remained perfectly still beside the tree, occasionally whimpering softly as if trying to communicate something important. Diana had learned to trust the dog's instincts over the years. Scout had alerted them to weather changes, unstable ground, and even a bear encounter that could have turned dangerous if they hadn't been warned in advance. Looking back through Tom's geological surveys that evening, Diana found several references to the area where she'd discovered the tree anomaly. Tom had conducted extensive water quality testing throughout the region, documenting seasonal changes and long-term trends that helped local authorities manage watershed resources. His notes from the mid-1980s showed some unusual readings, mineral concentrations and pH levels that didn't match the surrounding area, but he'd attributed these to natural geological variations. Now, staring at her sketch of the embedded object, Diana wondered if Tom's anomalous readings might have had a different explanation. The location was too close to be coincidental, and Tom's scientific mind would have been intrigued by the same mystery that was now capturing her imagination. She made her decision while sitting at Tom's old desk, surrounded by his maps and notebooks. Tomorrow, she would return to the tree with proper equipment. Whatever was hidden inside that pine had been waiting for decades to be discovered. Scout's reaction suggested it was significant, and Diana's instincts, honed by 30 years of reading the wilderness, told her this was something that needed to be understood. The next morning, Diana packed her largest hiking pack with everything she might need for an extended investigation. Along with her usual wilderness gear, she included Tom's geological toolkit, small picks and brushes for careful excavation, sample containers, measuring tools, and a portable scale. She also brought camping equipment, knowing that extracting the object without damaging it might take considerable time. Scout seemed to understand their mission was different that day. He stayed close to Diana's side as they hiked back to the fallen pine, his attention focused and alert. When they reached the tree, he immediately returned to his position beside the embedded object, settling down as if prepared for a long vigil. Diana spent several minutes examining the bulge from different angles, planning her approach. The object appeared to be wrapped in some kind of material that had helped preserve it within the tree's heartwood. Getting to it would require careful removal of the surrounding wood, layer by layer. Without damaging whatever lay inside, she began working with Tom's smallest geological pick, gently scraping away the softest wood around the edges of the embedded object. The work was slow and meticulous, but Diana found herself falling into the same patient rhythm that had served her well during countless forest ranger investigations. Some discoveries couldn't be rushed, and this felt like one of them. As the hours passed and more of the object became visible, Diana realized she was looking at something deliberately preserved. The wrapping appeared to be some kind of canvas or oilcloth, professionally sealed to protect whatever lay inside. This wasn't something that had accidentally become embedded in the tree. It had been hidden there intentionally by someone who understood how nature could be used to conceal secrets. By late afternoon, Diana had exposed enough of the object to see that it was roughly cylindrical, about the size of a large thermos bottle. The preservation material was intact, suggesting that whatever was inside had been protected from moisture and decay for a very long time. Scout had remained at his post throughout the day, occasionally standing to stretch, but always returning to his vigil beside the tree. As the sun began to set behind the western peaks, Diana made the decision to extract the object completely. Using Tom's tools and her own careful technique, she gradually worked it free from its wooden prison. The moment it came loose, Scout stood and wagged his tail for the first time all day. As if something important had finally been accomplished, Diana held the mysterious package in her hands, feeling its weight and studying the careful way it had been sealed. Whatever was inside represented someone's attempt to preserve something important enough to hide in the heart of an ancient tree. Tomorrow she would discover what secret had been waiting all these years to be found. But tonight, as she and Scout made their way back to the cabin through the gathering darkness, Diana felt a familiar excitement building in her chest. It was the same feeling she'd experienced during her best days as a forest ranger, when careful observation and patient investigation had led to discoveries that mattered. Tom would have loved this mystery, and Diana was determined to solve it in his honor. Diana barely slept that night. The mysterious package sat on Tom's workbench in the cabin's main room, its weathered canvas wrapping seeming to whisper of secrets in the lamplight. She'd resisted the urge to open it immediately, knowing that whatever lay inside deserved the same careful attention she'd used to extract it from the tree. Some discoveries required proper preparation, and this felt like one of them. The next morning dawned grey and overcast, with the promise of snow in the heavy clouds that clung to the higher peaks. Diana prepared her coffee and breakfast, while Scout watched the package from his favorite spot by the wood stove. As if he too understood the significance of what they'd found. After fortifying herself with hot coffee and scrambled eggs, Diana cleared Tom's workbench and laid out clean white cloth to serve as a work surface. She gathered Tom's magnifying glass, his precision measuring tools, and a camera to document whatever she was about to discover. If this package contained evidence of something important, she wanted to record every detail properly. The canvas wrapping was secured with what appeared to be marine-grade rope, tied in a series of complex knots that spoke of someone with sailing or climbing experience. Diana recognized the pattern. It was designed to hold securely while still being removable by someone who understood the technique. Tom had used similar knots during their camping expeditions, learned from his time in the Coast Guard before they met, working carefully with a small knife. Diana began cutting through the rope at strategic points, preserving as much of the original knotwork as possible. The canvas beneath was remarkably well preserved, confirming that whoever had hidden this package had understood the importance of proper waterproofing and protection. As the outer wrapping fell away, Diana found herself looking at a collection of items that made her heart race with excitement and apprehension. Inside the canvas were several black film canisters, each labeled with dates from the summer of 1985. Alongside the film was a small notebook bound in waterproof material, its pages filled with neat handwriting that included GPS coordinates, observations, and what appeared to be a detailed log of photographic subjects. The notebook's cover bore the initials JR in faded ink, and the first page contained a contact information section filled out in the same careful handwriting. Jesse Rivera, environmental photographer, freelance correspondent, Denver, Colorado. Below this was a phone number and an address that Diana recognized as being in one of Denver's older neighborhoods. Scout had moved closer to the workbench, his nose twitching at the scents released from the open package. Diana noticed his behavior was different from his usual curiosity about new objects. There was an alertness in his posture that reminded her of his reaction at the tree, as if he sensed the importance of what they'd discovered. Diana opened Jesse Rivera's notebook to the first entry, dated June 15th, 1985. The handwriting was clear and precise, characteristic of someone accustomed to taking detailed field notes. Arrived in the mountain region to investigate reports of industrial activity in areas designated as Wilderness Preserve. Local contacts provided tips about unusual nighttime truck traffic and chemical odors in several remote locations. Beginning photographic documentation tomorrow, the entries continued chronologically through the summer, describing Rivera's systematic investigation of what appeared to be illegal industrial activity in the Colorado high country. His notes mentioned meetings with anonymous sources, careful surveillance of suspected dumping sites, and growing concern about environmental contamination being deliberately concealed. By July, Rivera's entries had taken on an increasingly urgent tone. Chemical analysis confirms presence of industrial solvents and heavy metals in groundwater samples. Contamination levels are dangerous, potentially fatal if consumed over time. Corporate logo on equipment visible in night photography matches Titan Industries' subsidiary markings. This is deliberate toxic waste disposal in protected wilderness areas. Diana felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain weather. Rivera had apparently uncovered evidence of illegal toxic waste dumping in the same region where Tom had later conducted his geological surveys. The coordinates in Rivera's notebook matched several locations where Tom had recorded anomalous water quality readings throughout the 1980s. In 1990s, the final entries in Rivera's notebook were dated in late August 1985. Meeting tonight with county official who claims to have evidence of systematic cover-up. Says Titan Industries has been paying local authorities to ignore dumping operations. Promised to provide documentation if I can guarantee protection for his family. This goes deeper than environmental crime. It's corruption at multiple levels of government. August 28, 1985. County contact failed to appear at agreed meeting location. Attempt to reach him by phone unsuccessful. Local sheriff's department claims no knowledge of his whereabouts. Growing concern that my investigation has been discovered. Moving evidence to secure location as insurance against threats. That was the final entry. Whatever had happened to Jesse Rivera after August 28, 1985, he'd apparently never had the chance to continue his documentation. Diana realized she was holding what might be the only surviving evidence of his investigation. Evidence that someone had hidden so carefully it had remained undiscovered. For nearly 40 years, with trembling hands, Diana opened the first film canister. Inside were rolls of 35mm black and white film, still in their protective containers and apparently in good condition despite the decades of storage. The film had been wrapped in additional waterproof material and stored with desiccant packets to prevent moisture damage. Rivera had clearly understood the importance of preserving his evidence. Diana had learned film development during her early years as a forest ranger. When documenting wildlife violations and environmental damage, required skills that digital photography would later make obsolete. Tom had maintained a darkroom in the cabin's basement for his geological documentation, and all the equipment was still functional. Developing Jesse Rivera's film took most of the afternoon. Diana worked carefully in the red-lit darkroom, following procedures she hadn't used in years, but that came back to her with the muscle memory of old skills. One by one, the images emerged in the developer solution, revealing scenes that made Diana's blood run cold. The photographs showed a massive environmental disaster in progress. Image after image documented trucks dumping barrels of industrial waste into carefully excavated pits in the forest. The pictures captured workers in hazmat suits spreading soil over the dumped materials, effectively burying evidence of contamination that could poison groundwater for generations. Several photos showed equipment and vehicles clearly marked with Titan Industries logos, while others captured license plates and identifying numbers that would have provided law enforcement with specific evidence of the company's involvement. Rivera had been thorough in his documentation, creating a comprehensive record of illegal activity that should have resulted in criminal prosecutions and massive environmental cleanup efforts. But the most disturbing photographs were those showing the scale of the operation. This wasn't limited dumping or isolated incidents. Rivera had documented a systematic program of toxic waste disposal that covered multiple sites across several counties. The buried contamination represented an environmental time bomb that would continue poisoning the land and water for decades to come. Diana's hands shook as she hung the final prints to dry. Among the last photographs Rivera had taken were images of official documents, permits and correspondence that appeared to show coordination between Titan Industries and local government officials. The photos were taken at night, apparently during Rivera's meeting with his unnamed county contact, and showed clear evidence of corruption and deliberate cover-up. As she studied the developed photographs by lamplight, Diana began to understand the full scope of what Rivera had uncovered. This wasn't just environmental crime. It was a conspiracy involving corporate executives, government officials, and law enforcement personnel who had worked together to hide one of the worst toxic waste disasters in Colorado history. The coordinates in Rivera's notebook matched locations throughout the region, where Diana and Tom had hiked for decades. Some of the contaminated sites were near popular camping areas and fishing streams. Others were upstream from Cedar Ridge and other mountain communities that depended on groundwater wells for their drinking water supply. Diana realized with growing horror that she and Tom had unknowingly been living in the middle of a contaminated zone for their entire marriage. Tom's geological surveys had detected the contamination, but without understanding its source, he'd attributed the anomalous readings to natural causes. Now Diana understood that her husband had been documenting the long-term effects of deliberately buried toxins. Scout had remained close to Diana throughout the day, seeming to sense her emotional state as she processed the implications of Rivera's evidence. As evening approached, and Diana finally emerged from the darkroom with the developed photographs, the dog moved to her side and pressed against her leg in a gesture of comfort and support. Standing in her cabin surrounded by evidence of environmental devastation and government corruption, Diana felt the same sense of purpose that had driven her best work as a forest ranger. Jesse Rivera had died trying to expose this truth, and his evidence had waited nearly 4 decades for someone to find it. Tom's anomalous geological readings finally made sense, and Diana suspected his accidental death might not have been accidental at all. If Rivera could be silenced for investigating the contamination, Tom might have been killed for documenting its ongoing effects. Diana made her decision as she organized Rivera's photographs and notes into a comprehensive evidence file. She would complete Jesse Rivera's investigation and expose the truth about the toxic waste cover-up, no matter who had tried to bury it. The people of Cedar Ridge and the surrounding communities deserved to know they'd been living with poisoned groundwater for decades. But first, she needed to understand exactly what she was dealing with and who might still be willing to kill to keep these secrets hidden. Rivera's evidence was nearly 40 years old, but corruption and cover-ups had a way of perpetuating themselves across generations. Diana suspected the same forces that had silenced Rivera might still be operating in the region, and she would need to be very careful about how she proceeded. Tomorrow, she would begin her own investigation into the current state of the contamination and the people responsible for hiding it. Tonight, she would study every detail of Rivera's evidence and prepare for what might be the most important work of her life. Diana spent the next 3 days immersed in Jesse Rivera's evidence, cross-referencing his photographs and coordinates with Tom's geological surveys and creating a comprehensive map of the contamination sites. The scope of the environmental disaster became clearer with each connection she made, and the implications grew more disturbing. Rivera's photographs showed 12 separate dumping sites spread across 3 counties, all located in areas that would eventually drain into major water sources for downstream communities. The buried toxic waste included industrial solvents, heavy metals, and chemical byproducts that could cause cancer, neurological damage, and birth defects, even in small concentrations. Tom's water quality data from the 1980s and 1990s showed steadily increasing contamination levels downstream from each dumping site. But without Rivera's evidence, the source had remained a mystery. Now Diana understood that her husband had been unknowingly documenting one of the most comprehensive environmental cover-ups in state history. The realization that she and Tom had been living in a contaminated zone for decades was deeply unsettling. But it also explained some troubling patterns Diana had noticed over the years. Health problems in Cedar Ridge seemed unusually common for such a small community. Higher rates of cancer, unexplained neurological issues, and reproductive problems that residents attributed to the challenges of mountain living. Doc Martinez had mentioned these patterns during several of Diana's visits with Scout, wondering aloud about potential environmental factors, but lacking the data to support his suspicions. Now Diana realized the veterinarian's instincts had been correct. The community had been slowly poisoned by contamination that should have been cleaned up 40 years ago. Diana's first step was to research. Jesse Rivera himself, hoping to understand what had happened to the environmental photographer after his final notebook entry in August 1985. Using Tom's old computer and the cabin's satellite internet connection, she began searching for any records of Rivera's disappearance or death. What she found was troubling. Jesse Rivera had been reported missing by his Denver landlord in September 1985, after failing to return from what was described as a routine photography assignment in the mountains. The missing person case had been handled by the county sheriff's department, the same agency that Rivera suspected of being compromised by Titan Industries corruption. The official investigation had concluded that Rivera likely died in an accidental fall while photographing wildlife in hazardous terrain. His body was never found, and the case was closed after 6 months, with minimal effort devoted to searching the areas where Rivera had actually been working. Diana recognized the pattern of a deliberately superficial investigation, designed to avoid discovering inconvenient truths. More disturbing was what Diana learned about Rivera's reputation and experience. He wasn't an amateur photographer who might have died through carelessness or inexperience. Rivera had been a professional environmental photographer with extensive wilderness experience, specializing in documenting corporate environmental crimes. He'd won several journalism awards for previous investigations and was known for his meticulous approach to gathering evidence. Rivera's death fit a pattern Diana had seen during her forest ranger career: convenient accidents that eliminated people who posed threats to powerful interests. She'd investigated several cases where environmental activists or potential witnesses had died under suspicious circumstances, only to have her findings suppressed or ignored by superiors, who claimed to lack sufficient evidence for further investigation. Diana's research into Titan Industries revealed a corporation with a long history of environmental violations and cover-ups. The company had been involved in defense contracting, chemical manufacturing, and mining operations throughout the western United States, leaving behind a trail of contaminated sites and silenced whistleblowers. In the 1980s, Titan Industries had faced increasing pressure from environmental regulations and disposal costs that cut into their profit margins. The company's solution had been to establish networks of illegal dumping operations in remote areas where oversight was minimal and local officials could be bought or intimidated into cooperation. The Colorado operation, documented by Rivera, appeared to be one of several similar programs Titan Industries had operated throughout the region. Court records from other states showed patterns of bribery, intimidation, and even violence used to protect the company's illegal activities from exposure. Diana realized she was dealing with an organization that had killed to protect its secrets before and might not hesitate to do so again. Rivera's evidence represented a direct threat to people who had spent decades covering up environmental crimes, and some of those people might still be in positions of power. Her research into local officials from the 1985 period yielded troubling connections. The county commissioner at the time had been a young man named Bradley Walsh, who had started his political career as an aide to the commissioner and had steadily risen through local government ranks. Walsh was now the current county commissioner, having held the position for over 15 years. Diana found newspaper articles from Walsh's early campaigns that emphasized his commitment to balanced economic development and practical environmental policies. Reading between the lines, she recognized the language typically used by politicians who prioritize corporate interests over environmental protection. More concerning was Walsh's pattern of supporting development projects in areas that Rivera's evidence showed were heavily contaminated. Over the past decade, Walsh had approved construction, permits for several residential and commercial developments on sites that should have been designated as toxic waste cleanup zones. Diana cross-referenced Walsh's approved developments with Rivera's contamination map and found an almost perfect correlation. Either Walsh was remarkably unlucky in his site selections, or he knew exactly where the contamination was buried and was deliberately approving construction that would expose future residents to dangerous toxins. The implications were staggering. If Walsh had been involved in the original cover-up and was now facilitating development on contaminated land, hundreds of families could be unknowingly living in homes built on toxic waste burial sites. The health consequences would take years to manifest, but they would be devastating when they did. Diana's investigation of current water quality data confirmed her worst fears. Despite decades of contamination, no comprehensive testing had been conducted in the affected areas. The few tests that had been performed showed results that should have triggered immediate health warnings and environmental cleanup efforts. But the data had been buried in bureaucratic reports that received little public attention. Scout had begun showing symptoms that Diana now recognized as potential signs of environmental exposure. The dog was drinking more water than usual, experiencing occasional digestive problems, and seemed less energetic during their daily walks. Diana realized that Scout's symptoms might be early, indicators of the same contamination effects that were slowly poisoning the entire region. The veterinary clinic where Doc Martinez practiced had seen increasing numbers of pets with unexplained health problems over the past several years. When Diana called to discuss Scout's symptoms, the veterinarian confirmed that he'd been puzzled by patterns of illness that didn't match typical disease or injury causes. It's like something in the environment is making them sick. Doc Martinez explained, "I've been recommending that people switch to bottled water for their pets, but I haven't been able to identify the specific cause. Do you have any theories?" Diana promised to share her findings with Doc Martinez once she'd completed her investigation. The veterinarian's observations provided additional confirmation that Rivera's evidence was accurate and that the contamination was still actively harming the community. As Diana organized her growing collection of evidence, she realized she needed help from someone with expertise in environmental law and the resources to take on powerful corporate and government interests. Rivera had tried to work alone and had been silenced before he could expose the truth. Diana was determined not to make the same mistake. She decided to contact an old friend from her forest ranger days who had become an environmental journalist in Denver. Sarah Kim had spent her career investigating corporate environmental crimes and had the professional connections needed to ensure Rivera's evidence received proper attention from law enforcement and regulatory agencies. Diana composed a careful email to Sarah, explaining that she'd discovered evidence of historical environmental crimes that might still pose public health threats. She avoided mentioning specific details, knowing that email communications could be monitored by people who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill to protect their secrets. Sarah's response came within hours, expressing immediate interest and suggesting they meet in person to discuss the evidence. Diana agreed to drive to Denver the following week, bringing copies of Rivera's photographs and documentation to share with someone who understood how to navigate the complex world of environmental crime investigation. As she prepared for the trip to Denver, Diana couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Several times during her recent trips to Cedar Ridge for supplies, She'd noticed the same vehicles on the mountain roads and unfamiliar faces in places where everyone usually knew everyone else. Scout had also become more alert during their walks, occasionally stopping to stare at distant ridgelines as if he'd detected sounds or scents that concerned him. Diana trusted the dog's instincts and began varying their hiking routes and, at times, to make their movements less predictable. The evidence Diana had discovered represented justice for Jesse, Rivera, and potentially life-saving information for thousands of people who'd been unknowingly exposed to toxic contamination. But it also represented a direct threat to powerful people who had successfully hidden their crimes for nearly 40 years. Diana understood that her investigation had reached a critical point where the stakes would only continue to escalate. Rivera's evidence was too important to ignore, but pursuing justice would require careful planning and reliable allies. The people responsible for the cover-up had killed before, and Diana had no illusions about the risks she was taking. But Tom's memory and Rivera's sacrifice demanded that the truth finally be exposed, regardless of the personal cost. Diana was committed to seeing the investigation through to its conclusion, whatever that might require. Diana's drive to Denver took her through 3 hours of mountain highways, giving her time to think about the best way to present Rivera's evidence to Sarah Kim. The weight of the waterproof document case on the passenger seat served as a constant reminder that she was carrying proof of crimes that had been hidden for nearly 4 decades. Sarah had suggested they meet at a coffee shop near the University of Denver, a public location that would allow them to review documents without attracting attention. As Diana navigated the city traffic, she found herself checking her mirrors more frequently than usual, still unable to shake the feeling that her movements were being monitored. Sarah Kim looked exactly as Diana remembered her from their forest ranger days, compact and energetic, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She'd established herself as one of the region's most respected environmental journalists, known for her thorough investigations and willingness to take on powerful corporate interests. Diana, "It's so good to see you," Sarah said, embracing her old friend warmly. "I was sorry to hear about Tom. I know how much you two meant to each other." Diana felt the familiar pang of loss at Tom's mention, but also a renewed sense of purpose. "Thank you. Actually, Tom's work is part of why I wanted to talk with you. I think he may have been documenting evidence of environmental crimes without realizing it. They found a quiet corner booth where Diana could spread out some of Rivera's photographs without attracting attention from other customers." Sarah's expression grew increasingly serious as Diana explained the discovery of the hidden evidence and its implications for the surrounding communities. "This is extraordinary documentation," Sarah said, examining Rivera's photographs with a magnifying glass she'd brought for reviewing evidence. Jesse Rivera was a legend in environmental journalism circles. His disappearance was one of the great mysteries of the field. A lot of us suspected he'd uncovered something too big for his own safety. Sarah's familiarity with Rivera's reputation confirmed Diana's assessment of the evidence's significance. "Do you think there's enough here to pursue prosecution? It's been nearly 40 years, but surely there's no statute of limitations on environmental crimes of this magnitude." "Environmental crimes can be prosecuted decades after they occur, especially if there's ongoing damage," Sarah explained. "The bigger challenge will be identifying current officials who might still be connected to the original cover-up. Corporate executives retire or die, but government corruption tends to perpetuate itself across generations." Diana shared her research on County Commissioner Bradley Walsh and his pattern of approving development on contaminated sites. Sarah immediately recognized the name from her own investigations into Colorado political corruption. "Walsh has been on my radar for years," Sarah said. "He's been remarkably successful at attracting development investment to his county, but several environmental groups have questioned his approval processes. No one's been able to prove deliberate misconduct, But the patterns are suspicious. Sarah's confirmation of Walsh's questionable practices strengthened Diana's theory that the original corruption network was still operating. What would it take to build a prosecutable case against current officials? We'd need evidence linking them directly to knowledge of the contamination and deliberate decisions to hide it from the public, Sarah explained. Rivera's photographs prove the original crimes, but we need documentation showing current officials know about the contamination and are actively concealing it. Diana pulled out Tom's geological surveys, showing how his water quality data correlated with Rivera's contamination sites. My husband documented the ongoing effects for over a decade. If current officials have access to this data but haven't acted on it, wouldn't that constitute criminal negligence? Sarah studied Tom's meticulous records, cross-referencing dates and locations with Rivera's evidence. This is exactly what we need. Your husband created an unintentional timeline of the contamination spread. If we can prove that county officials had access to this information and failed to protect public health, we have grounds for prosecution. The conversation was interrupted when Sarah's phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and frowned. I need to take this. It's my editor at the Environmental Protection Agency. Something must be urgent. Diana watched Sarah's expression grow increasingly concerned as she listened to the caller. After several minutes of terse conversation, Sarah hung up and turned back to Diana with obvious worry. That was about a situation developing in your area. The EPA received an anonymous tip about illegal dumping in the mountains near Cedar Ridge. They're planning to send an investigation team next week. Diana felt a chill of apprehension. Do you think someone knows about Rivera's evidence? It's possible, Sarah said. Or it could be coincidental. Environmental crimes have a way of eventually surfacing, especially when they're as extensive as what Rivera documented. The question is whether the investigation will be thorough or whether it will be controlled by the same interests that covered up the original crimes. Sarah's concern was justified based on Diana's research into local corruption patterns. If Walsh and other compromised officials could influence the EPA investigation, Rivera's evidence might be dismissed or suppressed once again. What can we do to ensure an honest investigation? Diana asked. We need to get Rivera's evidence into the hands of federal investigators before local officials can interfere, Sarah said. I have contacts in the EPA's Criminal Investigation Division who specialize in cases involving corporate government corruption. They'll know how to protect the evidence and pursue prosecution independently of local authorities. Diana agreed to let Sarah coordinate with federal investigators, but she insisted on maintaining copies of all evidence in secure locations. Rivera's photographs and documentation had survived nearly 4 decades of concealment. She wasn't going to risk losing them to political interference or bureaucratic incompetence. Before leaving Denver, Diana and Sarah developed a plan for the next phase of the investigation. Sarah would contact her EPA sources and arrange for federal investigators to review Rivera's evidence. Diana would return to the mountains and continue documenting current contamination levels, building a comprehensive case that connected historical crimes to ongoing public health threats. They also discussed security precautions, acknowledging that Diana's investigation had reached a level where personal safety became a legitimate concern. Sarah had covered several cases where environmental whistleblowers faced intimidation or worse, from corporate interests willing to use violence to protect their secrets. Trust your instincts, Sarah advised. If you feel like you're being watched or followed, take it seriously. Rivera was an experienced investigator, and something happened to him before he could expose the truth. Don't let confidence in your wilderness skills make you underestimate the people you're dealing with. The drive back to Cedar Ridge gave Diana time to process the full implications of her investigation. Rivera's evidence represented not just historical crimes, but ongoing threats to thousands of people who had been unknowingly exposed to toxic contamination for decades. The health consequences were already manifesting in the community. and they would only get worse if the contamination wasn't addressed. Diana realized that her investigation had evolved beyond seeking justice for Rivera and Tom. It had become a race to prevent further harm to innocent families who were slowly being poisoned by buried toxic waste. The responsibility felt overwhelming, but it also strengthened her resolve to see the investigation through to its conclusion. As she reached the mountain roads leading home, Diana noticed a dark SUV that seemed to be maintaining a consistent distance behind her. When she varied her speed or changed lanes, the vehicle made similar adjustments. Scout, riding in the passenger seat, had also become alert, occasionally looking back toward the following vehicle with obvious concern. Diana tested her suspicions by taking an unnecessary exit and circling back to the highway. The SUV followed her through the entire maneuver, confirming that she was indeed being followed. Someone was very interested in her movements, and that someone had the resources to conduct professional surveillance, rather than returning directly to her cabin. Diana drove to Cedar Ridge and parked at the general store, where Betty and James Chen would provide witnesses to her presence. She needed to establish that she was safe and accounted for, in case her followers had more sinister intentions than simple surveillance. Betty immediately noticed Diana's tense demeanor. "Everything all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Diana glanced out the store window and saw the dark SUV parked across the street, its occupants clearly watching the store. "I think I might have picked up some unwanted attention on my drive back from Denver. Have you noticed any strangers in town lately?" Betty followed Diana's gaze toward the SUV. "Matter of fact, yes. Same vehicle's been around for the past few days. James thought they might be tourists, but they don't seem interested in the usual tourist things." The confirmation that Diana had been under surveillance for several days was deeply unsettling. Someone had been tracking her movements since before her trip to Denver, which meant her investigation had attracted attention from people with significant resources and professional capabilities. Diana purchased supplies she didn't need while considering her options. Going directly home would lead her followers to the cabin where Rivera's evidence was stored. But staying in town indefinitely wasn't practical, and she needed to access Tom's equipment to continue documenting the contamination. She decided to visit Doc Martinez's veterinary clinic, using Scout's health concerns as a legitimate reason to delay her return home. The veterinarian might also provide useful perspective on the environmental health patterns she'd been investigating. Doc Martinez was concerned about Scout's symptoms and agreed to run blood tests that might reveal environmental exposure. "I've been seeing similar symptoms in other animals lately," he explained. "Something in the environment is definitely affecting our local wildlife and domestic animals." Diana shared some of her findings with Doc Martinez, explaining that she'd discovered evidence of historical toxic waste dumping that might be connected to current health problems in the community. The veterinarian's reaction confirmed her assessment of the situation's severity. "That would explain everything I've been seeing," Doc Martinez said. "The health patterns in local animals have been puzzling, but environmental contamination would account for all the symptoms." "How extensive is the contamination?" Diana described the scope of Rivera's evidence without revealing specific details about her ongoing investigation. Doc Martinez listened with growing alarm as he realized the implications for both human and animal health throughout the region. "This information needs to reach public health authorities immediately," Doc Martinez said. "People have a right to know if their water supply is contaminated. How do we make sure the right people get this evidence?" Diana explained that she was already working with environmental journalists and federal investigators to ensure proper handling of the evidence. Doc Martinez agreed to document health patterns in local animals that might support the contamination claims, providing additional scientific evidence for any future prosecution. As evening approached, Diana realized she would need to return to her cabin despite the surveillance risks. The evidence hidden there was too important to leave unprotected, and she needed access to Tom's equipment to continue her investigation. The dark SUV followed her up the mountain road toward her cabin, maintaining the same professional distance it had used all day. Diana drove slowly and carefully, using her knowledge of the terrain to plan potential escape routes if the surveillance escalated to more direct threats. When she reached her cabin, the SUV parked at a distant overlook where its occupants could monitor her property without being easily approached or identified. Diana realized she was now living under constant observation by people who might be willing to use violence to protect the secrets she'd uncovered. But Rivera's evidence represented truth that had been buried too long, and Diana was determined to see it exposed regardless of personal risk. Tomorrow, she would begin the most dangerous phase of her investigation, documenting current contamination levels at sites where powerful people had killed to keep their secrets hidden. Diana woke before dawn to find the dark SUV still positioned at the overlook, its occupants apparently committed to round-the-clock surveillance. She prepared coffee and breakfast while watching the vehicle through her kitchen window, noting the professional patience of whoever was monitoring her movements. These weren't amateur investigators or curious tourists. They were experienced operatives following someone they considered a serious threat. Scout had barely touched his food, and Diana noticed his water consumption had increased significantly overnight. The dog's deteriorating condition served as a constant reminder of the contamination's ongoing effects and strengthened her determination to expose the truth. Despite the personal risks using Tom's geological equipment, Diana planned to visit the contamination sites Rivera had documented, taking current readings that would prove the toxic waste was still actively poisoning the environment 40 years after burial. The evidence she collected would support prosecution of current officials who had knowledge of the contamination but failed to protect public health. She packed Tom's water testing kit, soil sampling tools, and portable chemical analysis equipment into her largest hiking pack. If she was going to be followed, she would at least gather evidence that would make the surveillance worthwhile. The contamination sites were scattered across difficult terrain that would challenge anyone trying to monitor her activities while maintaining concealment. Diana chose a route that would take her to 3 of Rivera's documented sites, using her forest ranger knowledge to navigate terrain that would be nearly impossible for vehicles to follow. The dark SUV would have to remain on the main roads while she disappeared into wilderness areas where professional surveillance would be difficult to maintain. Scout seemed reluctant to leave the cabin, showing unusual anxiety about their hiking routine. Diana respected the dog's instincts, but needed his companionship for what might be a dangerous day in contaminated areas where she couldn't predict what they might encounter. The first contamination site was located in a grove of dead aspen trees that Rivera had photographed during the original dumping operations. Diana's readings confirmed her worst fears. Toxic chemicals were still leaching from the buried waste, creating a zone of environmental devastation that had expanded significantly. Since Rivera's time, water samples showed concentrations of industrial solvents and heavy metals that were dozens of times higher than safe drinking water standards. Soil samples revealed contamination that extended far deeper than Rivera's photographs had suggested, indicating that the buried waste had been breaking down and spreading through groundwater systems for decades. Diana documented everything with Tom's equipment, creating a comprehensive record of current contamination levels that could be compared with Rivera's historical evidence. The combination of past and present data would provide prosecutors with irrefutable proof that toxic waste had been poisoning the environment continuously since the illegal dumping began. As she worked, Diana noticed Scout becoming increasingly agitated. The dog paced nervously and repeatedly looked back toward the trail they'd used to reach the contamination site. Diana trusted Scout's instincts about potential danger and decided to cut her investigation short rather than risk confrontation in an isolated location. They were hiking back toward the main trail when Diana heard the unmistakable sound of helicopters approaching from the valley below. Through the trees, she glimpsed two aircraft that appeared to be conducting search patterns over the area where she'd been working. Someone had escalated their surveillance to include aerial monitoring, suggesting they were very concerned about her activities. Diana used her forest ranger training to avoid the helicopter search, moving through dense tree cover and rocky terrain that would make her difficult to spot from above. Scout stayed close to her side, seeming to understand that they were evading pursuit rather than simply hiking. The helicopters maintained their search for over an hour, systematically covering the contamination sites Rivera had documented. Diana realized her investigation had triggered a massive response from people with significant resources and military-style operational capabilities. The implications were deeply troubling. She was dealing with adversaries who could deploy professional surveillance teams and aircraft on short notice. When the helicopters finally departed, Diana made her way to a second contamination site located near a mountain stream that fed into Cedar Ridge's water supply. Her readings at this location were even more alarming than the first site, showing contamination levels that posed immediate health threats to anyone using the downstream water sources. Diana realized that residents of Cedar Ridge had been unknowingly consuming contaminated water for decades, which explained the health problems Doc Martinez had been observing in both humans and animals. The buried toxic waste was steadily poisoning an entire community, and the responsible parties were using intimidation and surveillance to prevent exposure of their crimes. Her satellite phone rang as she was collecting water samples from the contaminated stream. Sarah Kim's voice carried obvious urgency as she reported developments from Denver. "Diana, we have a problem. Someone's been asking questions about your visit yesterday. My editor received calls from county officials claiming you might be suffering from mental health issues related to your husband's death. They're suggesting your evidence might be the product of grief-induced delusions." Diana felt a surge of anger at the transparent attempt to discredit her investigation. "Let me guess, County Commissioner Walsh was involved in these calls." "He was the primary contact," Sarah confirmed. "Walsh claims he's concerned about your welfare and wants to ensure you receive appropriate mental health support. It's a classic technique for discrediting whistleblowers, attack their credibility rather than address their evidence." The timing of Walsh's intervention confirmed Diana's suspicions about his involvement in the ongoing cover-up. He's trying to get ahead of the story before federal investigators can review Rivera's evidence. How do we counter this? "I've already briefed my EPA contacts about the situation," Sarah said. "They're familiar with political interference tactics and won't be swayed by character assassination attempts. But we need to be prepared for escalating pressure as your investigation gains official attention." Diana described the helicopter surveillance and her current contamination readings, which only increased Sarah's concerns about the opposition they were facing. These people have resources and connections that go far beyond local corruption. Be very careful about who you trust and where you go. As Diana continued her investigation at the second contamination site, she discovered evidence that the buried toxic waste had been disturbed in recent years. Fresh excavation marks and altered drainage patterns suggested someone had been conducting unauthorized activities at the site, possibly attempting to conceal or relocate some of the buried materials. The implications were staggering. Current officials weren't just covering up historical crimes. They were actively manipulating evidence to hide the full extent of the contamination. Diana photographed the disturbed areas and collected samples that would prove recent human activity at what should have been an undisturbed toxic waste site. Her investigation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching on a nearby service road. Diana quickly gathered her equipment and moved to a concealed position where she could observe without being detected. Through the trees, she saw county vehicles and personnel who appeared to be conducting their own investigation of the contamination site. Diana recognized County Commissioner Walsh among the officials, along with several men in business suits who were clearly not government employees. Their presence at a site Rivera had documented as contaminated confirmed Diana's theory that current officials had detailed knowledge of the buried toxic waste and were actively working to conceal it from public awareness. Using Tom's binoculars, Diana observed the group's activities and photographed their presence at the contamination site. Walsh and the business representatives spent considerable time examining the areas where Diana had detected the highest contamination levels, suggesting they were monitoring the situation and possibly planning additional concealment efforts. The group's behavior was consistent with people who knew exactly what was buried at the site and were concerned about recent disturbances that might expose their secrets. Diana realized she was witnessing active conspiracy to hide environmental crimes that continued to threaten public health. When the officials finally departed, Diana completed her investigation of the second contamination site and collected comprehensive evidence of both historical dumping and recent tampering. The combination of Rivera's photographs, Tom's geological data, and her current readings created an irrefutable record of environmental crimes spanning 4 decades. Scout had remained alert throughout the day, occasionally whimpering softly when contamination levels were particularly high. Diana realized the dog's declining health was providing real-time confirmation of the toxic waste's ongoing effects, serving as a living indicator of environmental damage that threatened every resident of the region. As evening approached, Diana made her way back toward the cabin through terrain that would be difficult for her watchers to monitor. She needed time to analyze the day's findings and plan her next moves in an investigation that had clearly escalated beyond simple research into active confrontation with powerful adversaries. The evidence she'd collected proved that Rivera's contamination was still actively poisoning the environment and that current officials were working to hide the truth from the communities at risk. Diana's investigation had reached a critical point where exposure of the crimes would require courage that might cost her everything. But silence would condemn thousands of innocent people to continued poisoning. Tomorrow, she would take the most dangerous step in her investigation, directly confronting the people responsible for 40 years of environmental crimes and cover-up. Diana spent the evening in Tom's study, surrounded by his geological surveys and maps, searching for any clues she might have missed about his final weeks. If Tom had suspected the contamination's true source before his death, he might have left evidence that would help her understand the full scope of the conspiracy she was confronting. Scout lay beside Tom's desk chair, his breathing labored and his appetite completely gone. Diana had made an appointment with Doc Martinez for the next morning, but she feared the dog's condition was deteriorating too rapidly for medical intervention to be effective. The contamination that had claimed Jesse Rivera and possibly Tom was now threatening the last living connection to her previous life. As Diana reviewed Tom's final survey reports, she noticed inconsistencies she'd missed during her earlier examination of his work. Several water quality readings had been recorded but never included in his official reports to county authorities. The missing data showed contamination levels that should have triggered immediate environmental health warnings. Tom's private notes, written in the margins of maps and survey forms, revealed his growing concern about the anomalous readings. Contamination pattern inconsistent with natural sources, he'd written beside one particularly disturbing measurement. Industrial origin likely, requires immediate investigation. Diana realized Tom had suspected deliberate contamination in the weeks before his death, but had apparently planned to conduct additional testing before making formal accusations. His cautious, scientific approach had probably saved his life temporarily, but someone had eventually recognized the threat his investigation posed to their secrets. Hidden in Tom's geological equipment case, Diana found a small digital recorder she'd never seen before. When she played it, Tom's voice filled the study with observations he'd apparently made during his final fieldwork. October 12th, Contamination levels at Site 7 have increased dramatically since last month's readings. This isn't seasonal variation or natural mineral leaching. Someone is actively dumping toxic materials in protected watershed areas. The concentrations are dangerous enough to cause serious health problems for anyone using downstream water. Sources. Diana's hands trembled as she listened to her husband's voice describing the same contamination Rivera had documented. 15 years earlier, Tom had independently discovered the ongoing environmental crimes, but he'd been murdered before he could expose the truth. October 15th, attempted to contact EPA regional office, but was told investigation would require coordination with local authorities. Called county commissioner's office and was scheduled to meet with Bradley Walsh next week. Need to document everything carefully before presenting evidence. These accusations will have serious implications. The final recording was dated 3 days before Tom's death. October 18th. Walsh postponed our meeting indefinitely, claiming scheduling conflicts. Growing concern that local officials may be compromised. Water quality readings from this week show contamination spreading to additional sites. Can't wait for bureaucratic approval. People's health is at stake. Planning to contact Federal Environmental Protection Agency directly, Diana realized. Tom had been killed because he'd discovered the same conspiracy Rivera had exposed and was planning to bypass local authorities who were part of the cover-up. His accidental fall had occurred on October 21st, just 3 days after his final recording and 1 day before his planned contact with federal investigators. The parallels between Tom's investigation and Rivera's were too precise to be coincidental. Both men had independently discovered evidence of systematic toxic waste dumping. Both had planned to expose corrupt local officials. And both had died in suspicious accidents before they could complete their investigations. Diana's grief over. Tom's death was now compounded by rage at the people who had murdered him to protect their environmental crimes. Her husband had died trying to protect public health, and his killers had succeeded in silencing him for 3 years. But Rivera's hidden evidence had survived long enough to expose the truth, and Diana was determined to complete both men's work regardless of personal cost. Her satellite phone rang at dawn, waking her from troubled sleep on Tom's study couch, where she'd fallen asleep, surrounded by his final research. Sarah Kim's voice carried obvious concern as she reported overnight developments. "Diana, you need to be very careful today. My EPA contacts say someone's been pressuring their supervisors to halt any investigation in your area. The pressure is coming from congressional level. Someone with serious political connections wants this story." Buried, Diana felt a chill of apprehension as she realized the opposition had resources that extended far beyond local corruption. "How high does this conspiracy go?" "That's what we're trying to determine," Sarah said. Titan Industries had extensive government contracts during the 1980s, including Defense Department work that created classified waste products. If their illegal dumping involved disposal of classified materials, national security agencies might be involved in the cover-up. The possibility that national security considerations were complicating. The investigation explained the professional surveillance and helicopter monitoring Diana had experienced. Environmental crimes involving classified materials would attract attention from agencies with resources and legal authorities that exceeded normal law. Enforcement capabilities. What do we do if federal environmental protection is compromised? By national security interference? Diana asked. "We go public," Sarah said. "Environmental crimes can't be classified indefinitely if they pose ongoing public health threats. My newspaper is prepared to publish Rivera's evidence if federal investigators won't act on it." Properly, Diana agreed to continue, gathering current contamination data while Sarah worked to ensure Rivera's evidence reached honest investigators who couldn't be intimidated or bought by corporate interests. But first, Diana needed to take Scout to Doc Martinez and confront the reality that the contamination was claiming another victim. Doc Martinez's examination confirmed Diana's fears about Scout's condition. Blood tests showed toxic metal concentrations that indicated serious environmental poisoning, and the dog's symptoms were consistent with prolonged exposure to industrial solvents and chemical waste products. "I'm sorry, Diana," Doc Martinez said gently. "Scout's been exposed to contamination levels that are causing organ damage. We can try supportive treatment, but the prognosis isn't good." "Where has he been drinking water recently?" Diana explained her investigation of the contamination sites, realizing that Scout had been exposed to the same toxins that were slowly poisoning the entire community. The dog's illness provided tragic confirmation of the environmental crime's ongoing effects. "This information could save lives," Doc Martinez said, after reviewing Diana's contamination data. "People need to know their water supply is compromised. How can we get this information to public health authorities?" Diana described the political interference that was preventing proper federal investigation, and Doc Martinez offered to document health patterns in local residents that might support contamination claims. "I've been seeing symptoms in humans that match what Scout is experiencing. If we can prove environmental causation, it might force official action." As Diana left the veterinary clinic with Scout weakened but stable, she noticed the dark SUV had been joined by additional surveillance vehicles. Her investigation had clearly escalated to a level where multiple teams were monitoring her movements around the clock. Sheriff Reynolds was waiting in the parking lot beside Diana's truck, his expression serious as he approached her. Diana had known Reynolds for years and generally trusted his integrity. But she realized that local law enforcement might be compromised by the same corruption that had protected the environmental crimes for decades. "Diana, I need to talk with you about some concerns that have been brought to my attention," Reynolds said carefully. "County Commissioner, Walsh says you've been making accusations about environmental contamination that might be causing unnecessary panic in the community." Diana recognized the approach. Walsh was using local law enforcement to pressure her into abandoning her investigation. "Sheriff, have you seen the evidence I've collected? The contamination is real, and it's affecting people's health right now." Reynolds glanced toward the surveillance vehicles and lowered his voice. "I'm not questioning your findings, Diana, but there are powerful people who don't want this information made public, and they have resources that go far beyond what we can handle at the county level. I'm worried about your safety." The sheriff's warning confirmed that local law enforcement was aware of the conspiracy but felt powerless to challenge it. Reynolds was trying to protect Diana while acknowledging that he couldn't provide official support for her investigation. "What would you do if someone was poisoning your family?" Diana asked. "Would you stay quiet to avoid powerful enemies, or would you fight to protect the people you love?" Reynolds was quiet for a long moment before responding. "I'd fight, but I'd be very careful about who I trusted and how I went about it. Some battles can't be won through normal channels." Diana understood the sheriff's position. He was sympathetic, but constrained by political realities that made official support impossible. She would have to continue her investigation without law enforcement protection, relying on her own resources and the allies she could trust completely. That evening, Diana made copies of all evidence and hid them in multiple locations throughout the mountains, using techniques Tom had taught her for protecting geological samples from theft or tampering. If something happened to her, the evidence would survive to ensure Rivera's sacrifice and Tom's death weren't meaningless. Scout's condition continued deteriorating through the night, providing Diana with a heartbreaking reminder of the contamination's human cost. Every family in the region was being slowly poisoned by buried toxic waste, and their suffering would continue until someone had the courage to expose the truth. Regardless of personal consequences, Diana's investigation had reached the point where further progress would require direct confrontation with the people responsible for 40 years of environmental crimes and murder. Tomorrow, she would take the most dangerous step in her quest for justice, forcing the conspirators to choose between exposure and escalating violence that might finally attract the federal attention they'd spent decades avoiding Diana's world shattered at 3:17 a.m. when she found the medical examiner's report hidden in Tom's geological files, a document that revealed her husband's death had been murder, not accident, and that the official cause of death had been deliberately falsified by authorities she'd trusted for 3 years. The report was signed by Dr. Elizabeth Foster, the county medical examiner who had retired shortly after Tom's death under circumstances Diana had never questioned. Foster's original findings showed evidence of blunt force trauma to Tom's head that was inconsistent with injuries from an accidental fall, along with defensive wounds on his hands that indicated he'd fought his attacker before being thrown from the cliff. Diana's hands shook as she read Foster's suppressed conclusions. Victim shows clear signs of assault prior to fatal fall. Head trauma pattern suggests deliberate striking with blunt instrument. Defensive injuries on hands and forearms indicate struggle occurred before victim was pushed or thrown from height. Cause of death, homicide. Attached to the suppressed report was a handwritten note from Foster explaining why she'd been forced to change her findings. Received direct pressure from County Commissioner and State Attorney General's office to revise cause of death determination. Threats made against my family if original findings were released. Changed official report to accidental death under duress. Maintaining original documentation as insurance against further threats. Diana realized that Tom had hidden Foster's true report among his geological papers, knowing it would eventually be found if something happened to him. Her husband had suspected he was in danger and had taken precautions to ensure evidence of his murder would survive even if he didn't. The medical evidence proved Tom had been killed by the same people responsible for Rivera's disappearance and the toxic waste cover-up. Diana's grief transformed into focused rage as she understood that her husband had died protecting the same truth she was now trying to expose, but Foster's report revealed an even more disturbing truth. The corruption extended into the State Attorney General's office and involved officials Diana had assumed were trustworthy. The conspiracy to hide environmental crimes had compromised law enforcement and regulatory agencies at multiple levels of government. Diana's satellite phone rang as dawn broke over the mountains. Dr. Foster's voice, barely above a whisper, as she explained why she'd finally decided to break her silence about Tom's death. "I've been following your investigation through mutual contacts," Foster said. "When I learned you'd found Rivera's evidence, I realized the same people who killed your husband are still operating. I can't stay silent anymore. Too many people have died to protect these secrets." Foster explained that she'd been forced to retire early after changing Tom's death certificate, but she'd maintained copies of all her original findings in case the corruption was eventually exposed. "Your husband was murdered because he discovered proof of ongoing toxic waste dumping. The people responsible have killed before, and they'll kill again to protect their operation." Diana asked Foster to testify about Tom's murder if federal investigators could guarantee protection for her family. "I'm prepared to do whatever's necessary to expose the truth," Foster said. "But we need prosecutors who can't be intimidated or bought by corporate interests." After Foster's call, Diana realized her investigation had reached a critical turning point. She now had evidence of murder, environmental crimes, and government corruption spanning 4 decades. But she also understood that exposing the truth would require confronting adversaries who had demonstrated their willingness to kill witnesses and manipulate official investigations. Diana spent the morning creating comprehensive evidence packages that documented the entire conspiracy, from Rivera's original investigation through Tom's murder to current contamination levels. She prepared multiple copies using different methods: digital files, printed documents, and physical evidence samples hidden in locations throughout the mountains using techniques that would ensure discovery even if she didn't survive to guide investigators. Scout's condition had worsened overnight, his breathing labored, and his response to Diana's voice increasingly weak. The dog's decline served as a heartbreaking reminder of the contamination's human cost and strengthened Diana's resolve to complete her husband's work regardless of personal risk, Sarah Kim called, as Diana was preparing for what might be her final day of investigation. "Diana, we have a breakthrough. My EPA contacts have found an honest investigator in the Criminal Enforcement Division who specializes in cases involving corporate government corruption. Special Agent Jennifer Martinez is flying to Colorado today to review Rivera's evidence." The news provided Diana with hope that federal intervention might finally break the conspiracy's hold on local and state authorities. Will Martinez be able to operate independently of the officials who've been compromised? She has authority to conduct investigations without local coordination when national environmental crimes are suspected, Sarah explained. Rivera's evidence and your contamination data suggest violations that cross state lines and involve federal water resources. Martinez can bypass local authorities entirely. Diana agreed to meet with Martinez the following day, but first she needed to complete her documentation of current contamination levels at all sites Rivera had identified. The comprehensive evidence would provide prosecutors with irrefutable proof of ongoing environmental crimes and help establish criminal liability for current officials who had knowledge of the contamination. As Diana prepared for her final field investigation, she noticed the surveillance teams had withdrawn from their usual positions around her cabin. The absence of watchers was more troubling than their presence had been. It suggested the opposition had decided on a different approach to ending her investigation. Diana's instincts told her the sudden reduction in surveillance meant immediate danger rather than decreased interest in her activities. People who had killed Rivera and Tom wouldn't hesitate to eliminate another threat to their secrets, especially when federal investigators were preparing to review evidence that could destroy their entire operation. She left detailed instructions for scouts, care with Doc Martinez, and prepared emergency communications to Sarah Kim and Agent Martinez that would automatically transmit if she failed to check in at predetermined intervals. Diana was determined to ensure her evidence would reach federal investigators, even if she didn't survive to present it. Personally, the contamination sites Diana visited that day showed evidence of recent disturbance that hadn't been present during her previous investigations. Fresh excavation marks and newly installed drainage systems suggested someone was attempting to alter the contamination patterns before federal investigators could document the original crime scenes. Diana realized she was witnessing active destruction of evidence as the conspirators attempted to cover their tracks in response to her investigation. The timing confirmed that her activities had forced them into panic mode, where they were making mistakes that might provide additional proof of their guilt. At the largest contamination site, Diana discovered heavy equipment operating under cover of environmental remediation permits that had been fast-tracked through county approval processes. Workers in hazmat suits were excavating and relocating buried toxic waste, but their activities appeared designed to hide evidence rather than properly clean up contamination. County Commissioner Walsh was present at the site, directing operations and coordinating with contractors who were clearly not legitimate environmental cleanup specialists. Diana photographed Walsh's involvement in what appeared to be destruction of evidence while she documented the true extent of contamination. Before it could be concealed or moved, her investigation was interrupted when one of the workers spotted her position and alerted the site supervisor. Diana found herself surrounded by men who were clearly not environmental contractors, but rather security personnel hired to protect the evidence destruction operation. Walsh approached Diana's position with obvious anger and desperation. "Mrs. Walsh, you're interfering with authorized environmental cleanup activities. I'm ordering you to leave this area immediately." Diana confronted Walsh with her knowledge of his involvement in the 40-year cover-up, showing him photographs that proved his participation in both historical crimes and current evidence destruction. "Commissioner, I have documentation proving you've been hiding toxic waste contamination for decades while approving development on contaminated sites. Walsh's reaction confirmed Diana's accusations. Instead of denying involvement or challenging her evidence, he attempted to negotiate. You don't understand the complexity of this situation. Environmental cleanup is expensive and complicated. We've been working to manage the contamination responsibly while protecting the local economy. You've been poisoning families for 40 years to protect corporate profits, Diana responded. Jesse Rivera died trying to expose your crimes, and you murdered my husband when he discovered the truth. Walsh's expression revealed knowledge of both murders, confirming Diana's theory that local officials had been directly involved in silencing whistleblowers. Mrs. Walsh, some secrets are too dangerous to expose. There are national security implications you couldn't possibly understand. The reference to national security confirmed Sarah's theory that classified waste materials were involved in the illegal dumping operation. Walsh was suggesting that environmental crimes had been committed under cover of protecting national defense secrets, making prosecution more complicated, but not impossible. Diana realized Walsh was stalling while his security team moved to surround her position. She activated her emergency communication system and began broadcasting her location and situation to Sarah Kim and Agent Martinez, ensuring her confrontation with the conspirators would be documented even if she didn't survive it. Commissioner Walsh, federal investigators are already reviewing evidence of your involvement in environmental crimes and murder, Diana announced loudly enough for all present to hear. Killing me won't stop the investigation. It will only add another murder charge to your eventual prosecution. Walsh's response revealed the desperation of people who had spent decades believing their crimes were successfully hidden. You have no idea what forces you're challenging. This goes far beyond local corruption. There are people involved who will do anything to protect national security interests. Diana understood that Walsh was both threatening her and attempting to justify environmental crimes as necessary for national defense. But Rivera's evidence and Tom's murder proved that corporate profits, not national security, had motivated 40 years of toxic waste dumping and cover-up. As Walsh's security team moved to detain Diana, she heard the distinctive sound of helicopters approaching from multiple directions. But instead of the surveillance aircraft she'd encountered previously, these helicopters bore federal law enforcement markings and were landing at the contamination site in a coordinated operation. Special Agent Martinez had apparently used Diana's emergency signal to coordinate immediate federal intervention, arriving with sufficient force to prevent Walsh and his associates from silencing another whistleblower. Diana's investigation had finally attracted the federal attention necessary to break a conspiracy that had operated with impunity for 4 decades. But as federal agents secured the site and began arresting Walsh and his contractors, Diana realized her personal victory would be overshadowed by Scout's condition and the knowledge that Tom's murder might have been prevented if Rivera's evidence had been discovered years earlier. Justice was finally possible, but it had come at a cost that would shadow her remaining years in the mountains she and Tom had loved. Special Agent Jennifer Martinez arrived at the contamination site like an avenging force of federal justice. Her team of environmental crime investigators moving with the precision of professionals who understood they were confronting adversaries with decades of experience in violence and cover-up. Diana watched from a secure position as agents systematically documented evidence while securing Walsh and his contractors for questioning. Martinez was a compact woman in her 40s with the focused intensity of someone who had spent years pursuing corporate criminals who thought their wealth and connections made them untouchable. She approached Diana with obvious respect for what the civilian investigator had accomplished under dangerous circumstances. Mrs. Walsh, what you've uncovered here represents one of the most extensive environmental crime conspiracies in federal history, Martinez said, as her team continued processing the scene. Rivera's evidence combined with your husband's documentation and current contamination data provides us with a prosecutable case spanning 4 decades. Diana felt a surge of satisfaction at the confirmation that Rivera's sacrifice and Tom's death would finally result in justice. Agent Martinez, how extensive is the conspiracy? We know Walsh and Titan Industries are involved, but there seem to be connections to state and federal agencies as well. Martinez's expression grew grim as she explained the preliminary findings of her investigation. Corporate records show Titan Industries had defense contracts that generated classified waste products requiring special disposal procedures. Instead of following proper protocols, they established illegal dumping operations in remote areas where oversight was minimal. The involvement of classified materials explained the national security complications that had protected the conspiracy from exposure for so long. Environmental crimes involving defense waste were subject to special classification procedures that made investigation and prosecution extremely difficult. Classification issues don't excuse 40 years of environmental crimes and murder, Diana said. People have been poisoned and killed to protect corporate profits disguised as national security concerns. I agree completely, Martinez replied. Environmental crimes can't be classified indefinitely when they pose ongoing public health threats. My team has authority to declassify evidence necessary for prosecution, regardless of original security. In classifications, Martinez explained that Diana's evidence had triggered a comprehensive federal investigation involving multiple agencies with jurisdiction over environmental crimes, public corruption, and national security violations. The scope of the investigation reflected the seriousness of crimes that had affected thousands of people across several states. We'll need your testimony about everything you've discovered, including the circumstances of your husband's death and Rivera's evidence, Martinez said. Are you prepared to testify before federal grand juries and in eventual criminal trials? Diana confirmed her willingness to do whatever was necessary to ensure prosecution of the people responsible for environmental crimes and murder. Agent Martinez, my husband died trying to expose these crimes. I owe it to his memory and to Rivera's sacrifice to see this through to conviction. As federal agents continued documenting the evidence destruction operation, Diana realized the investigation had reached a critical phase where success would depend on her ability to provide testimony that couldn't be discredited or suppressed by corporate defense attorneys with unlimited resources. The evidence Diana had collected was comprehensive, but courtroom success would require her to withstand cross-examination by lawyers who would attempt to portray her as a grieving widow whose judgment had been compromised by loss and isolation. She needed to prepare for legal combat against adversaries who had successfully hidden their crimes for 4 decades. Martinez arranged for Diana to work with federal prosecutors who specialized in environmental crime cases, helping her prepare testimony that would withstand the most aggressive defense strategies. Corporate defense teams will try to discredit you personally rather than address the evidence, Martinez warned. We need to be prepared for character assassination attempts and procedural challenges designed to delay or derail prosecution. Diana spent the following week working with federal investigators to organize evidence and prepare comprehensive testimony that would support prosecution of Walsh, Titan Industries executives, and other conspirators who had participated in the environmental crimes and cover-up. The investigation revealed the full scope of corruption that had protected the illegal dumping operation. State environmental officials had been bribed or intimidated into ignoring contamination reports, while federal oversight had been blocked by classification procedures that were deliberately misused to hide corporate crimes. Dr. Foster provided crucial testimony about Tom's murder and the pressure she'd faced to falsify his death certificate. Her medical evidence proved Tom had been killed to prevent exposure of the contamination, establishing criminal liability for murder in addition to environmental crimes. Scout's condition continued deteriorating despite intensive veterinary treatment, providing heartbreaking confirmation of the contamination's ongoing effects. Doc Martinez documented the dog's illness as evidence of environmental poisoning that supported Diana's testimony about current contamination levels. Scout's blood chemistry shows toxic metal concentrations that are consistent with prolonged exposure to industrial waste products, Doc Martinez explained to federal investigators. His symptoms match patterns I've been seeing in other local animals, confirming that environmental contamination is still actively affecting the ecosystem. As the federal investigation expanded, Diana learned that similar illegal dumping operations had been conducted in other states where Titan Industries had defense contracts. The Colorado conspiracy was part of a nationwide program of environmental crimes that had affected communities across the western United States. Your investigation has opened the door to prosecuting environmental crimes that span multiple decades and several states, Martinez told Diana. Rivera's evidence was the key that unlocked everything. Without his documentation, we might never have understood the scope of what we were dealing with. The knowledge that Rivera's hidden evidence would result in justice for thousands of contamination victims provided Diana with satisfaction that helped ease her grief over Tom's death. Her husband's geological documentation had been crucial in proving the contamination's ongoing effects and establishing current officials' criminal liability. Sarah Kim's newspaper published the first comprehensive exposé of the contamination conspiracy, using Rivera's photographs and Diana's current evidence to document 4 decades of environmental crimes and government cover-up. The media attention created public pressure that made political interference with the federal investigation much more difficult. Public awareness is our best protection against attempts to suppress the investigation, Sarah explained to Diana. Corporate interests and corrupt officials can't operate in darkness when their crimes are front-page news across multiple states. Diana agreed to participate in media interviews that would maintain public attention on the investigation while her testimony was being prepared for federal court. The coverage helped identify additional contamination victims who could provide testimony supporting prosecution of the responsible parties. As Diana prepared for what might be months of legal proceedings, she made arrangements for Scout's care that acknowledged his declining condition. The dog had become a symbol of the contamination's human cost, and Diana was determined to ensure his suffering contributed to justice for all victims of the environmental crimes. Doc Martinez agreed to maintain detailed medical records of Scout's condition that would provide ongoing evidence of contamination effects throughout the legal proceedings. Scout's illness demonstrates the immediate health threats posed by buried toxic waste, the veterinarian explained. His condition puts a face on environmental crimes that might otherwise seem abstract to juries. Diana's cabin became a secure facility where federal investigators could review evidence and prepare prosecution strategies without interference from compromised local officials. The location provided symbolic significance. Justice for environmental crimes was being planned in the same mountains where Rivera and Tom had died trying to expose the truth. Martinez established a command center in Tom's study, using his geological maps and survey data to coordinate the comprehensive investigation that would ensure all responsible parties faced prosecution. Diana found comfort in seeing her husband's work finally receiving the attention and respect it deserved. Your husband's documentation provides the scientific foundation for our entire case, Martinez told Diana as they reviewed Tom's meticulous records. His water quality data proves the contamination has been ongoing for decades and establishes a clear timeline that connects historical crimes to current health threats. As the investigation progressed, Diana learned that federal prosecutors were preparing charges that could result in life sentences for the most serious offenders. Environmental crimes resulting in death carried penalties equivalent to murder, and the evidence of deliberate contamination affecting thousands of people supported prosecution under federal terrorism statutes. "We're not just dealing with corporate environmental violations," Martinez explained. "The scope and duration of the contamination, combined with the murders of witnesses, constitutes criminal conspiracy at the level of organized crime. The sentences will reflect the seriousness of crimes that have affected entire communities for generations." Diana's testimony preparation revealed details about the conspiracy that she hadn't fully understood during her investigation. Titan Industries had operated the illegal dumping program as part of a broader strategy to maximize profits from defense contracts by avoiding proper waste disposal costs. The company had systematically identified remote areas in western states where environmental oversight was minimal, and local officials could be corrupted through bribes or intimidation. The Colorado operation was one of at least 12 similar programs that had buried toxic waste across thousands of acres of public and private land. The environmental damage from these operations will take decades to remediate and cost billions of dollars, Martinez said. But the human cost in terms of illness, death, and destroyed communities is incalculable. This represents one of the worst corporate crimes in American history. As Diana's testimony was finalized, she realized the weight of responsibility she carried as the primary witness against conspirators who had successfully hidden their crimes for 40 years. Her words would determine whether justice was finally achieved, or whether Rivera's sacrifice and Tom's death would be meaningless. The evening before her first federal grand jury appearance, Diana sat with Scout in Tom's study, surrounded by evidence of her husband's final investigation. The dog's breathing was labored, but he seemed to understand the importance of staying close to Diana during the most crucial phase of their shared mission. "We did it, boy," Diana whispered to Scout as she stroked his graying fur. "Tom and Rivera would be proud. Tomorrow we start making sure their deaths weren't in vain." Scout's tail moved weakly in response to Diana's voice, his eyes reflecting the same determination that had driven him to find Rivera's hidden evidence. The dog had been an essential partner in exposing the truth, and Diana was determined to honor his contribution, regardless of how much time they had left together. Martinez called to confirm final preparations for Diana's testimony, emphasizing the historical significance of the case they were building. "Mrs. Walsh, what you've accomplished represents the kind of courage that democracy depends on. Citizens who risk everything to expose truth when governments and corporations fail in their responsibilities." Diana felt the weight of that responsibility as she prepared for sleep in the cabin where she and Tom had shared so many peaceful evenings before corporate crimes and government corruption had shattered their quiet life. Tomorrow would begin the most important work of her life, ensuring that environmental criminals finally faced justice for decades of poisoning communities and murdering witnesses. But even as she prepared for legal victory, Diana knew that no amount of justice could restore the years she'd lost with Tom, or heal the communities that had been slowly poisoned by buried toxic waste. The best she could achieve was preventing future crimes and ensuring that Rivera's evidence finally served its intended purpose of protecting innocent people from corporate environmental violence. As she drifted off to sleep with Scout breathing quietly beside her, Diana felt Tom's presence in the mountain silence that surrounded their cabin. Her husband's spirit would be with her in the courtroom, where his geological surveys and Rivera's photographs would finally expose the truth that had cost both men their lives. Tomorrow, the real fight for justice would begin. The federal courthouse in Denver felt like a temple of justice as Diana entered the grand jury chamber, where she would present evidence that had cost 2 lives and endangered thousands of others. Special Agent Martinez accompanied her through security procedures designed to protect witnesses who faced retaliation from powerful adversaries with resources and connections that extended across multiple states. Diana carried Tom's geological survey case containing copies of all evidence, from Rivera's original photographs to her own contamination readings that proved the toxic waste was still actively poisoning communities 4 decades after burial. The weight of the case reminded her that she was speaking for everyone who had been silenced or ignored by the conspiracy she was exposing. The grand jury chamber was smaller than Diana had expected, containing 23 citizens who would determine whether federal prosecutors had sufficient evidence to indict County Commissioner Walsh, Titan Industries executives, and other conspirators for environmental crimes and murder. Diana realized these ordinary people held the power to deliver justice that had been denied for nearly 40 years. Federal prosecutor Rebecca Santos introduced Diana to the grand jury as a retired forest ranger whose scientific investigation uncovered one of the most extensive environmental crime conspiracies in federal history. Santos emphasized that Diana's testimony would focus on factual evidence rather than speculation, ensuring the grand jury understood they were hearing documented proof of systematic criminal activity. Diana began her testimony by describing the discovery of Rivera's hidden evidence, explaining how Scout's behavior had led her to investigate the fallen pine, where the environmental photographer had concealed proof of illegal toxic waste dumping. She showed the grand jury Rivera's photographs, each image revealing the scope of environmental destruction that Titan Industries had buried beneath false remediation claims. Jesse Rivera documented systematic disposal of industrial toxic waste in protected wilderness areas, Diana testified, pointing to photographs that showed workers in hazmat suits burying barrels of chemical waste. These images proved deliberate environmental crimes designed to avoid proper disposal costs while hiding evidence from regulatory authorities. The grand jury examined Rivera's photographs with obvious shock as they realized the scale of environmental destruction that had been concealed from public awareness. Diana explained how Rivera's coordinates matched locations where Tom had later detected anomalous contamination levels, proving the buried waste was still leaching toxins into groundwater systems. Diana's testimony about Tom's murder brought the personal cost of the conspiracy into sharp focus. She presented Dr. Foster's suppressed autopsy report proving Tom had been killed to prevent exposure of the contamination, while his geological surveys showed he'd been documenting the crime scene without understanding its significance. My husband died because he discovered proof that toxic waste was poisoning water supplies used by thousands of families, Diana told the grand jury. His murder was committed to protect corporate profits and government corruption that had already cost Jesse Rivera his life. The medical evidence of Tom's assault and defensive wounds made it clear that his death had been deliberate violence rather than accidental fall. Diana's voice remained steady as she described the 3 years she'd spent believing her husband's death was accidental, not knowing he'd been murdered by the same people responsible for environmental crimes affecting her community. Santos guided Diana through testimony about current contamination levels that proved the buried toxic waste was still actively threatening public health. Diana's water and soil samples showed dangerous concentrations of industrial chemicals and heavy metals at levels that could cause cancer, neurological damage, and birth defects in exposed populations. The contamination documented by Jesse Rivera in 1985 has been spreading through groundwater systems for 40 years, Diana testified. Current readings show toxic metal concentrations dozens of times higher than safe drinking water standards, yet no public health warnings have been issued to affected communities. Diana presented evidence of County Commissioner Walsh's involvement in both historical cover-up and current attempts to hide contamination from federal investigators. Walsh's presence at evidence destruction operations proved he had detailed knowledge of buried toxic waste locations and was actively working to prevent proper cleanup efforts. The grand jury members asked detailed questions about Diana's investigation methods and the reliability of her evidence. demonstrating their understanding that they were being asked to indict powerful people based on complex scientific and legal testimony. Diana answered each question with the precision of someone who had spent months preparing for this moment. Santos concluded Diana's testimony by emphasizing the ongoing nature of the environmental crimes and the immediate threats posed to public health. Mrs. Walsh's investigation proves that toxic waste, buried 40 years ago, is still poisoning communities today, while responsible parties continue efforts to hide evidence and prevent proper remediation. As Diana left the grand jury chamber, she felt the weight of completing testimony that Tom and Rivera had died trying to deliver. Agent Martinez confirmed that the grand jury had heard compelling evidence of federal crimes warranting prosecution, but the formal indictment decision would require several days of deliberation. Diana returned to her cabin that evening knowing she had fulfilled her responsibility to expose the truth about environmental crimes that had shaped her entire adult life in the mountains. Scout greeted her with obvious relief, his declining condition serving as a constant reminder of the contamination's ongoing effects on innocent victims. Tomorrow, she would await the grand jury's decision while preparing for the next phase of legal proceedings that might take years to complete. But tonight, Diana allowed herself to feel satisfaction at having honored Tom's memory and Rivera's sacrifice by ensuring their evidence finally reached the federal investigators who could deliver justice. The mountain silence that surrounded her cabin felt different now. Not the peaceful isolation she'd treasured during her years of grief, but the quiet anticipation of justice that was finally within reach after 4 decades of corporate crimes and government cover-up. The grand jury's decision came 3 days later, with the force of federal justice finally unleashed. After decades of corporate impunity, Special Agent Martinez called Diana at dawn with news that would transform the quiet mountain community where environmental crimes had been hidden for 40 years. "We have indictments," Martinez announced with obvious satisfaction. "Federal charges against County Commissioner Bradley Walsh for conspiracy, environmental crimes, and murder. Titan Industries executives face additional charges for organized environmental terrorism affecting multiple states." Diana felt a surge of vindication as she realized Tom's death and Rivera's sacrifice would finally result in meaningful consequences for the people responsible. The federal indictments represented validation of everything she'd risked to expose. The truth about buried toxic waste and systematic government corruption. Martinez explained that the indictments were part of a coordinated federal operation involving environmental protection, criminal investigation, and national security agencies that had been quietly building cases against Titan Industries operations across several western states. Diana's evidence had provided the breakthrough that connected isolated environmental crimes to a comprehensive corporate conspiracy. "Your testimony convinced the grand jury that we're dealing with organized criminal activity that has affected thousands of victims over 4 decades, Martinez said. The indictments include terrorism charges based on the scope and duration of environmental contamination designed to cause mass harm. The terrorism charges reflected federal recognition that Titan Industries had engaged in environmental violence against civilian populations, using illegal toxic waste disposal to maximize corporate profits while deliberately hiding health consequences from affected communities. Diana understood that such charges carried penalties severe enough to ensure meaningful justice. Within hours of the indictments being unsealed, federal agents conducted simultaneous arrests of Walsh, Titan Industries executives, and other conspirators who had participated in environmental crimes and cover-up activities. Diana watched television coverage of Walsh being arrested at the county courthouse, where he'd spent decades protecting corporate environmental criminals from prosecution. The arrest footage showed Walsh's shock at finally facing consequences for crimes he'd apparently believed were permanently protected by corruption and classification procedures. Diana felt satisfaction at seeing the man responsible for Tom's murder finally held accountable for decades of environmental violence against innocent families. Media coverage of the arrests created immediate public pressure for comprehensive environmental cleanup and health monitoring in affected communities. Sarah Kim's newspaper published detailed maps showing contamination sites throughout the region, helping residents understand their exposure risks and demand proper medical evaluation. Doc Martinez called Diana to report an overwhelming response from community members seeking health evaluations related to environmental contamination. People are finally learning why they've been getting sick, he explained. The health patterns I've been documenting for years suddenly make sense when viewed as symptoms of toxic waste exposure. The medical confirmation of widespread contamination effects validated Diana's determination to expose the truth despite personal risks. Families who had suffered unexplained illnesses for decades were finally learning that their health problems resulted from deliberate corporate crimes rather than random misfortune. Federal environmental protection teams arrived in Cedar Ridge to begin comprehensive contamination assessment and emergency cleanup operations at the most dangerous sites. Diana served as a consultant to help investigators understand the scope and locations of buried toxic waste based on Rivera's documentation and her own field research. Your investigation has triggered the largest environmental crime prosecution in federal history, the lead EPA remediation specialist told Diana as cleanup operations began. The contamination mapping you've provided will be essential for protecting public health while evidence is preserved for prosecution. Diana worked with federal teams to ensure Scout received the best possible veterinary care while his condition was documented as evidence of ongoing contamination effects. The dog's illness provided tragic confirmation of environmental damage that had been deliberately hidden from public awareness. Dr. Foster arrived from her retirement to provide expert testimony about Tom's murder and the pressure she'd faced to falsify his death certificate. Her presence represented vindication for Diana's belief that her husband had been killed to prevent exposure of environmental crimes. Tom died trying to protect people from toxic waste contamination, Foster told federal investigators. His murder was committed to prevent him from warning families that their water supply was poisoned. Justice for Tom means justice for everyone who has been harmed by this conspiracy. As federal investigations expanded to include contamination sites in other states, Diana realized her mountain community had become the center of environmental justice efforts that would affect thousands of families across the western United States. Rivera's hidden evidence had finally served its intended purpose of exposing corporate environmental crimes. The knowledge that her investigation would result in comprehensive cleanup and prosecution provided Diana with satisfaction that helped ease her grief over Tom's death. Her husband's geological surveys and Rivera's photographs were finally receiving the attention they deserved as crucial evidence of systematic environmental violence. But even as justice moved forward, Scout's declining condition reminded Diana that some damage from the environmental crimes could never be fully repaired. The dog's sacrifice, like Tom's and Rivera's, would contribute to preventing future victims, but it couldn't restore the years of health and happiness that had been stolen by corporate environmental criminals. As Diana prepared for months of additional testimony and legal proceedings, she felt Tom's presence in the mountain winds that had always provided comfort during difficult times. Her husband's spirit would guide her through the complex process of ensuring that environmental justice was finally achieved after 40 years of corporate impunity and government corruption. The truth had emerged from its hiding place in the ancient pine and justice would follow as surely as water flows downhill through the mountains Tom had loved and died protecting. 2 years after the federal indictments transformed Cedar Ridge from a contaminated community into a symbol of environmental justice, Diana stood beside the memorial plaque that marked the ancient pine where Jesse Rivera's evidence had waited 4 decades to expose the truth. The brass inscription honored Rivera, Tom, and all victims of the environmental crimes while commemorating the site where courage and persistence had finally overcome corporate corruption and government cover-up. Scout was buried beneath a small granite marker near the memorial tree, his sacrifice remembered alongside the human victims who had died protecting public health from toxic waste contamination. Diana visited both memorials each morning, finding comfort in the knowledge that their deaths had ultimately saved thousands of lives through comprehensive cleanup and prosecution of environmental criminals. The federal trials had resulted in life sentences for County Commissioner Bradley Walsh and Titan Industries executives who had organized the illegal dumping operations. Additional convictions reached into state government and federal agencies where corruption had protected environmental crimes for decades. Diana's testimony had been crucial in securing justice that many had believed impossible against such powerful adversaries. Dr. Elizabeth Foster had emerged from retirement to become a leading advocate for medical examiner independence, using her experience with Tom's murder to reform procedures that prevented political interference with forensic investigations. Her courage in exposing the falsified death certificate had helped convict Tom's killers, while ensuring future murder investigations couldn't be suppressed by corrupt officials. Sarah Kim had won National Journalism Awards for her coverage of the environmental crime conspiracy, establishing herself as one of the country's leading investigative reporters specializing in corporate government corruption. Her partnership with Diana had demonstrated how citizen investigators and professional journalists could work together to expose truth that traditional authorities were unwilling or unable to pursue. The environmental cleanup operations had transformed the contaminated sites from zones of buried toxic waste into restored wilderness areas where families could safely hike and camp without fear of poisoning. Federal remediation teams had removed thousands of tons of toxic materials while installing monitoring systems that would prevent future contamination of water supplies. Diana had accepted a position as federal environmental consultant, using her expertise to help investigate similar contamination sites throughout the western United States. Her work honored Tom's memory while ensuring that other communities wouldn't suffer the decades of hidden poisoning that had affected Cedar Ridge and surrounding areas. The Rivera Walsh Environmental Memorial and Education Center, built near the Discovery site, served as a permanent reminder of the importance of environmental protection and the courage required to challenge powerful interests that prioritize profits over public health. Diana served on the center's board, helping design educational programs that would inspire future generations of environmental advocates. Doc Martinez had expanded his veterinary practice to include environmental health monitoring for wildlife and domestic animals, using his experience with contamination symptoms to provide early warning systems for environmental threats. His work with Scout's illness had contributed to medical protocols that now protected both human and animal health in formerly contaminated areas. The Memorial Center's archives contained comprehensive documentation of Rivera's investigation, Tom's geological surveys, and Diana's evidence collection, preserving the complete record of how environmental truth had been hidden and ultimately exposed. Students and researchers from around the world visited to study the case as an example of successful environmental justice advocacy. Diana's cabin had been designated as a historic site, recognizing its role in the investigation that exposed one of the largest environmental crime conspiracies in American history. she continued living there while serving as a guide for visitors who wanted to understand how ordinary citizens could challenge corporate environmental crimes through careful investigation and persistent advocacy. The mountain community that had once been slowly poisoned by buried toxic waste had transformed into a model of environmental health and citizen engagement. Public awareness programs educated residents about environmental threats while empowering them to demand accountability from corporations and government agencies responsible for protecting public health. Diana's relationship with Dr. Foster had evolved from professional collaboration to personal friendship based on their shared experience of confronting powerful adversaries to expose environmental truth. Both women had found new purpose in their later years through work that honored the memories of people who had died protecting others from environmental violence. The legal precedents established by the federal prosecutions had strengthened environmental crime enforcement throughout the United States, making it more difficult for corporations to hide toxic waste disposal through corruption and intimidation. Diana's investigation had contributed to legal reforms that protected future whistleblowers, while ensuring more aggressive prosecution of environmental criminals. On quiet evenings, when Diana walked the trails where she discovered Rivera's evidence, she felt the presence of Tom and Scout guiding her steps through the restored wilderness they had died trying to protect. The mountain's silence that had once provided refuge from grief now offered peace that came from knowing justice had been achieved and truth had been preserved for future generations. The ancient pine where everything began had been carefully preserved as the centerpiece of the memorial site, its massive trunk serving as a natural monument to the persistence of truth and the power of individuals to challenge institutional corruption. Diana often sat beside the tree where Scout had first detected Rivera's hidden evidence, reflecting on how one moment of curiosity had led to justice for thousands of victims. The Education Center's most popular exhibit featured Rivera's original photographs displayed alongside Tom's geological surveys and Diana's contamination documentation, showing how 3 generations of investigators had contributed to exposing environmental crimes that spanned 4 decades. Visitors learned how scientific evidence, journalistic integrity, and citizen advocacy could work together to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. Diana's work with federal environmental protection continued to uncover additional contamination sites where corporate crimes had been hidden through corruption and classification procedures. Each successful investigation honored the memory of Rivera and Tom while preventing future victims of environmental violence disguised as legitimate business activity. As Diana approached her 70th birthday, she found satisfaction in knowing her investigation had transformed a legacy of environmental crime into a model of justice and remediation that would protect public health for generations. The truth hidden in the ancient pine had finally served its purpose, ensuring that corporate environmental criminals could no longer operate with impunity while innocent families suffered the consequences of buried toxic waste. The mountain winds that carried Tom's spirit through the restored wilderness whispered of justice achieved and truth preserved, reminding Diana that some discoveries change everything for everyone who comes after. Rivera's evidence had waited 4 decades to find someone with the courage and determination to expose it properly, proving that truth endures long enough to find its proper moment in history. Sometimes the mountains call us to find not just secrets, but justice.